So I want to talk to you today about pollinators. The world would be a completely different place if we didn't have all these pollinators, because 90% of flowering plants do rely on pollinators for reproduction, and so we wouldn't have these flourishing plant populations and all of the incredible plant biodiversity that we do have without them. So bees are one of the most important groups of pollinators. Of course, there are many different pollinating organisms, from hummingbirds to even lemurs. But bees are one of the very important groups, and I'm going to be focusing on bees today, and I'm going to be focusing especially on their role in crop pollination, where they are especially important. So it's a curious paradox that this planet is incredibly productive. We produce well more than enough food to feed every single person on the planet. And yet at the same time, we do have a huge problem of hunger. About 1 billion people go hungry every night. Another 1 billion people micronutrient deficient. And at the same time, no pun intended, a growing problem of obesity. So we have a lot of issues with our food system in terms of how it is feeding us. At the same time, our food system, the way we farm, our agriculture, is creating a lot of problems in planetary health as well. So agriculture is a huge contributor to climate change, to biodiversity loss, to antibiotic resistance, to oceanic dead zones, and the other things that you can read there on the screen. So together, these problems of unhealthy people, unhealthy planet, lead me to believe, and many other people as well, that we have a broken food system in some sense. It's not serving our needs as humans. It's not serving planetary needs. So I titled my talk From the Bee's Eyes, and you might be wondering, what do bees have to do with this healthy food system? I like to think of asking the bees. Let's ask the bees, how do we get to a healthy food system? Maybe they have something to say about it, as they are very important in crop pollination. So many of you have probably heard you can thank a bee for 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat. That's more or less true, that about 1/3 of plant-based of crop production does benefit, is produced via animal pollination. So that's that 1 out of 3 bites of food. But so what about all the rest? Well, that's because so much of crop production that we rely on for our caloric intake is pollinator-independent plants. It's wind-pollinated grains, staple crops like corn and rice and wheat. So that's why it's only 1 out of 3 bites of food. But when you think about it from the perspective of the number of different crops that we eat, the nutritional diversity that we enjoy, then we're talking about 75% of crops that do benefit from the visits of an animal pollinator, usually a bee. And this includes not only things that we enjoy, but things that make us healthy, that have there's the caloric part, but then there's the vitamins. So they're producing a lot of the vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, and various lipids that we need in our diet. And you can't just take vitamin supplements and forget about it, because those vitamin supplements also will need to come from somewhere, and again, it's often from an animal-pollinated plant. So we really need these bees for our diet. And I always like to remember also about some other things that we enjoy, and I call this the other vitamin C. Chocolate, of course, is one of the main ingredients. The main ingredient is from cacao, which is pollinator-dependent plant. It's not pollinated by a bee. It's actually pollinated by these tiny biting midges that are kind of the tropical biologist's anathema. Because they're very unpleasant. But they do have this other very important role in our world, because they are absolutely essential for pollinating cacao. We wouldn't have chocolate without them. So it used to be in agricultural landscapes that people did not really worry about pollination at all. When crop fields were small and when farm fields were embedded in landscapes that look like this one, mosaic landscapes that have a lot of natural features, a lot of natural habitats, that was not something that the farmer managed. The farmer managed the soil. The farmer might worry about pests, but the farmer did not need to manage pollinators. They were present, they were abundant on the farm itself or coming from the surrounding regions, from the surrounding habitats. And here I'm not talking about the honeybee, at least not in North America, because honeybees are not native to North America. This is the European honeybee that I'm talking about. It came from Europe. It came over here with early settlers, I believe, in around 1600 or so. And the main reason they brought the honeybees along was because they needed wax so they could have candles. Not even for the honey, it was for the wax. Very important because you need light. So what I'm talking about in these kinds of landscapes are all of the other bee species. Does anybody want to guess how many bee species there might be in the world? And all of those you already know because you learned it in your entomology class. Don't answer. But maybe one of the kids wants to give a guess. What do you think? Oh my God. That has never, ever happened. He got it right. It's never happened. So I think maybe he got a clue from his family, or he's been studying or something, because usually I get numbers like usually the highest number of people will say is 1,000. And I mean, I've done this a lot. This is the first time this has ever happened. Well done. 20,000 is, that's actually what we think. There are about 20,000 species of bees in the world. How about North America? Anybody else want to guess North America? Do you know North America? Okay. Well, it's less than 20,000, of course. Anybody want to guess? No? It's about 4,500 in North America, and we're especially rich in California. We have about 1,500 species. And we now know from some global sort of syntheses that we've done that if you go on average in any region in the world where some crop pollination studies have been done, we find that about 12% of the regional bee species pool is actually visiting crops. So it's the minority that visit crops, but still 12% of 20,000 bees. That's a lot to work with. There's a lot of species out there that are pollinating our crops, or that were pollinating our crops back when we had those kinds of landscapes. But our farming landscapes in many parts of the world have really changed. And so now we have these monoculture landscapes. And by monoculture, I mean planting the same thing over vast areas in the entire field, and maybe from field to field. And this beautiful picture is a picture of almond orchards blooming in California. And that really creates a very different scenario for the pollinators. For one thing, in terms of the demand for pollinators, because each of those trees has about 50 to 100,000 blossoms. And this plant is self-incompatible. It requires visits from, it requires an animal pollinator to move the pollen actually between varieties. So from tree to tree, between these rows here that have different varieties. And so you can see that with so many blossoms and so many trees in the field, there's just a huge demand. And it's all happening within about 2 weeks on any given field for pollinators. And so the native pollinators that would have been present in that area, they're just not up to the task. There are not enough of them to do that because we've just got so many blossoms all at once. And in California, which produces 80% of the world's almonds, there are many fields that look like the fields you see there. So up and down the Central Valley, which is right here, this is the Central Valley, you have these fields kind of, if you drive up Highway 5, you see these big patches of white off in the distance in February and March when these things are blooming. So there's a lot of it. So that was why agriculture changed, and we had to start employing honeybees as pollinators. They were brought here for wax, then people liked them for honey, but now they're being used as pollinators. They're being transported, and so they're domesticated, semi-domesticated, and 100,000 or so individuals in each of those honeybee boxes. And a bunch of them get loaded up on the backs of semi-trucks and get driven all the way from Florida every year to pollinate almond in California. So that we have to bring about 1 million colonies across the country. So this is a little bit strange. I mean, most people, this is not sort of the thing that people just kind of know about, and it's kind of weird when you think about it, that's how we get our almonds. We have to drive these bees 3,000 miles to get our almonds, at least in our current farming system. And so along the way, the bees might be stockpiled in an area like this, and you can see there's no flowers around. And then when they get to the almond field, they like to get them out there before the almond actually blooms, so that as soon as the almond blooms, those bees are ready and can visit all those flowers. And there's nothing to eat. There are no flowers. And bees need flowers for nectar and pollen. So they get fed sugar water by the beekeepers, which is not very good for them either. I mean, you would not feel very good if you were fed sugar water every day, and they don't either. So this migratory bee phenomenon started sometime in the 1980s or so, as we started to have more and more almond and other crops that are that are grown in this fashion, and that would sort of demand or would create an economic market for bringing all these pollinators, so that the beekeepers actually find it more economically valuable to transport their bees this far for pollination as opposed to making honey. Around this time in the mid-1980s, there was also the inadvertent introduction of a pest on honeybees called Varroa destructor. It's really, literally is sort of a vampire. It's a little mite that sucks the blood of the larvae and the pupae and can transmit a disease, various diseases to them as well, and weakens them. So of course, when you've got all of these bees being driven across the country and different honeybees coming from different different beekeepers' yards and brought together, this is a great way to just spread all those diseases even more. And so in order to try to control the varroa mite, people have used a variety of different pesticides actually right in the hive. And these pesticides now do show up in honey too, so this is not a nice thing. Of course, the varroa mites have because they're reproducing rapidly in many generations, they have evolved resistance, and so there's been a series of different miticides that have been tried, and they are actually resistant to most of them. So it's a really big problem. These varroa mites are pretty much everywhere where there are European honeybees. So then around 2006 in the United States, we had this thing called colony collapse disorder that came out for the first time in 2006, and it's really mysterious. And basically, what you see on the top there is a normal honeybee colony with lots of workers. And then what would happen with colony collapse disorder is the beekeeper would go and open their hive, and they would find that there's most of the worker bees not there anymore, just simply disappeared. Not dead at the doorstep, which might have happened if they'd ingested a poison and then died, but just simply gone. The queen's still there, the brood is still there, and it's like this big mystery. What happened? Did aliens come and take them away? Do you think that aliens came and took them away? Did cell phones have something to do with it? People had this idea. Is it pesticides? What could it be? And this has also happened in, there have been a lot of colony losses. There have been exacerbated colony losses in many parts of the world. As you see, the USA, also in Canada, but I think it's not quite as bad here. In Europe, in the Middle East, in Japan. And so this phenomenon of increased colony losses is happening not just in the United States. It doesn't always look like colony collapse disorder, but just a lot more problems with keeping bees and making it much harder for beekeepers to maintain their economic livelihood. And at the same time, there have been mounting concerns about other pollinators, other bee species as well. Certain bumblebee species that we found to be have very, very shrunken ranges, very contracted ranges. Studies and that's in the United States and I don't think it's Canada, but just United States. In Europe, several studies finding big declines in the species richness of bee communities. And all of these concerns, the concerns about the honeybee and the concerns about other bees and other pollinator species, have led to some international actions. The Obama administration actually developed a national strategy to promote the health of honeybees and other pollinators. The IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, recognized the problem with pollinators and did a fast-track assessment so that one of their first reports is about pollinators, pollination, and food production. And so there are lots of different possible threats to pollinators. There's pesticides. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later on. There's some diseases. I mentioned already the problem of the varroa mite for honeybees. That's specific to honeybees, but there are many other viral diseases and other parasites, some of which are specific to the honeybees, some of which are in common with other bee species. And then we actually don't know that much about the diseases of most of the bee species. There's global change like climate change, land use change, invasive species that are influencing bee populations. And then there's the loss of floral resources and nesting resources for the bees. And we don't really know what causes something like colony collapse disorder or the problems of shrinking ranges, et cetera. But I think that we do know enough to realize that a lot of these things are very synergistic. They're acting together to create problems for pollinators. So it's not one single thing, but it's multiple interacting problems. And so I'm going to talk more about the ones that affect the agricultural realm the most, the pesticides and the loss of the resources. Because this comes together in my story about monoculture and the problem of monoculture for the pollinators. So I already mentioned that with monocultures we have this huge demand for pollinators. Thus we need honeybees to satisfy that demand. But when you have a monoculture crop, it also has impacts on the native pollinators. So you have a situation with the monoculture where when it's blooming, like the sunflower field, it's providing an enormous amount of resources all at once for pollinators. But the problem is then that when the bloom is done, that resource is gone, and we really have a situation of sort of fence row to fence row farming. So there are no other alternative resources, like that almond field that I showed that had no flowers at the time before bloom. So that's one problem, the lack of resources for the pollinators. But the other problem is that these monocultures also do really invite pests. They're kind of there's a big smorgasbord out there for any pest that can eat sunflower, for example, like the sunflower moth. And so they're going to have pest problems, and because they have that vulnerability and there is not really resources there to promote the natural enemies, the predators of those pests, then monocultures really have to rely on pesticides. And of course pesticides are to some extent indiscriminate and are going to affect beneficial insects as well as harmful ones, like the beneficial insects such as the pollinators. So we have this sort of triple or double whammy of the lack of resources combined with a very negative environment with these pesticides. And so one group or class of pesticides has come under a lot of scrutiny recently. And it's important because these pesticides are now the most widely used pesticides around the globe. They're used in many, many different ways. They're sprayed, they're drenched into the soil. And one of the most insidious ways that they're used is as a seed treatment. And why is that insidious? Well, it's because it's what we call a prophylactic treatment. So instead of observing a pest and then using a pesticide to take care of it, these seed treatments mean that the plant will be protected from its seed stage all the way through its life, whether there's a pest there or not. And that's really the problem with it. So we're using just a huge amount of these pesticides. In the U.S., corn is treated, soy is treated, cotton, sunflower, I think beets. And the corn alone, estimates have shown that about 57% of the agricultural acreage in the U.S. is treated with neonicotinoids every year, whether we need it or not. And it turns out we don't need it, because some studies have shown that really these pesticides are not actually targeting the primary pests of corn, and they're not very effective on the pests of soy. So all this pesticide being dumped out there in the form of seed treatments is not really needed. It's getting into the water. It's getting into everything. And why is this so bad? Well, this is a water-soluble pesticide, and so it actually gets into the plant, gets taken up into the plant, and goes through all the tissues of the plant, providing protection, which is great for the plant, the crop, but it isn't really good for the pollinators because it can go into the pollen and the nectar. And so then that's where the bees might encounter it. And so a bee might encounter it and wouldn't necessarily die from encountering this pesticide, because we have this phenomenon of a sublethal dose. So it's not going to kill it outright. But these pesticides affect neurotransmitters. And so they affect things in bees like navigation, foraging, learning, and the immune system. So imagine a honeybee leaves its hive to forage, to go and get pollen and nectar, and it encounters a sublethal dose of these pesticides while it's on a sunflower, getting this pollen and nectar, and then it can't find its way back to the hive. Because it's having problems with navigation, or it can't actually properly forage and bring back the resources to the hive. And so these are probably factors in the exacerbated colony losses and the phenomenon of colony collapse disorder that we see. So what have we learned from the honeybee? Well, that we need them for these monocultures. There's really no other way to pollinate them. So that we end up sort of treating honeybees themselves as a monoculture. The monocultures require the use of pesticides. Sometimes more pesticides than they really need are used, like these neonicotinoids. And then that has a negative influence on the honeybees. And so then the honeybees and our whole pollination system becomes sort of a weak link in the chain from the field, from the farm to the fork. That, it's a very brittle system. We're very dependent on this one pollinator species. And this one pollinator species has some major health problems. And that's not a good situation. It's not a resilient situation. It's a very brittle one. So let me go back to these native pollinators and how maybe they can help to provide some resilience, because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of options. There are 12% of our bee fauna that visits crops. So first I need to tell you that most of our bee species are not like the honeybee. They're not a social bee that has many individuals in its colony. Most of them are solitary. Many of them are ground nesting. So this is a typical life cycle of a bee, an Andrena species, we call them spring bees. They often emerge in the spring. And so at the top there you see a female on a flower. She's got pollen on her leg. She's collecting pollen from this flower. And then she has dug a little nest in the ground. And she goes back and forth to flowers to collect pollen until she has enough to make this pollen ball. She makes the pollen ball, and then she lays an egg on it. And then she seals up the nest, and that's it. There's no more parental care. It's just bye-bye, baby, you're on your own. And then this larva is going to feed on the pollen ball and molt and go through various stages and pupate. And then when it emerges from its pupal case in the spring, it'll dig its way out of the ground. And then it can mate and start the cycle over again. And so that's the typical life cycle of a solitary bee. And some of them nest in the ground, other ones nest in pre-existing cavities in trees, or they dig into wood. So with our solitary bees and with our bee communities, we have looked at crop situations and crop pollination and their contribution to that in a number of different places. And some of the work we did early on was in New Jersey, the Garden State. They grow lots of different things there. And in New Jersey, we see landscapes like this. They're very mosaic-y, like the first one I showed you. And when you look on the crop fields, they're very diverse, mostly small farms with a lot of different things. And we find there are very, very abundant and very diverse native bee communities. And we've done studies that show that they provide ample pollination for all of the crops, even the most pollinator-dependent crops that have the largest needs. You don't need to bring honeybees to this landscape, and none of the farmers do. But then we come out to California, where I work now, and we see these very large fields. We see that the fields are planted basically fence row to fence row. There's very little natural habitat or diversity in that landscape. And when you go on the field, you see that there's no floral resources. You see also, because they're tilled, that if there was a ground nesting bee in there, that it would probably have trouble. There really aren't any trees. There's no place for the twig nesting bees to nest. And then there's often frequent flooding of the fields for irrigation. So even if they did manage to develop a nest in the ground, they might get drowned. So this is a really bad landscape for bees, these kind of very large industrial scale fields. And of course, they're using a lot of pesticides too. So bad place for bees. And we don't find many. When we go out to the crops there, we see very few bee species and very few individuals actually visiting those crop fields. But we do have other types of farms in California, and we have studied these farms and again found that farms, for example, like this almond orchard that's right next to a large patch of natural habitat, are again getting visits by many different bee species and also fly species that are important contributors to pollination. Or when we go on to farms that are much more diversified, that have a lot of different floral resources and that are growing a lot of different crops, again, we find that these are like little oases and lots of bee diversity, and again, that the bees can provide sufficient pollination. So it definitely can happen in California. It just doesn't happen in most of California because of the way the farming landscape is. And so we've mapped this out, for example, in one county where we've done a lot of work. And this green here is natural habitat. The purple here, this is all the farm landscape. And what the purple means is that the bees that we find out there, their abundance and also their size and effectiveness as pollinators means that they're not providing enough pollination. So it's less than 30% of the pollination needs in this purple area, which is most of the agricultural region. But up in this farming valley here, we start to see some red and pink and some red right up here near these natural habitat areas. We get 100% of the pollination needs can be provided by the native pollinators that are there, and then some small spots down in these landscapes too. So not very much of the agricultural landscape is going to be able to be serviced by our native pollinators, at least in this part of California. But actually, to our surprise, we kind of modeled that out for the whole of the California agricultural region, the Central Valley here. And because quite a few of the cropping areas where pollinator-dependent crops are grown are near to natural habitat, within a few kilometers of natural habitat, we estimated that native bees actually contribute about 33% of crop pollination needs in California, and that translates to a value of about $2.4 billion. And our studies we have worked with scientists around the world. These are our studies right here, to put together studies from across the world to get a better understanding of native pollinators and their contributions to crop pollination. And we found, actually surprisingly, that the wild pollinators enhance the fruit set of crops regardless of honeybee abundance. The honeybees can be out there, we really don't see large increases in yield as their populations are increased, or as their abundance is increased, but we do see a large response to the increase in wild pollinators. So the wild pollinators are doing something different than the honeybees, and they're really making a big contribution. We've also used these kinds of synthetic data sets to understand how the wild pollinator communities are related to the surrounding land use and also to the farming practices. And what we find is that they respond additively to all of these things. So surrounding natural habitat really boosts their abundance and diversity, and having multiple crops on the field, polyculture, adds a bit more, and when it's organic agriculture, that adds yet a bit more. So all of these things are working together to produce healthier, more diverse and abundant bee communities. And then there's some, just sort of a cool sideline fact that we've found in a couple of systems in sunflower and also in almond, that when we have both wild pollinators together with the honeybees, that there are behavioral interactions between the wild pollinators and the honeybees that actually enhance the pollinating efficiency of the honeybees, makes the honeybees actually twice as effective every time they visit, which is really cool. And there's different reasons for that in sunflower versus almond, but we see the same phenomenon. So these native pollinators are valuable in their own right as pollinators. They're important for pollination. And also they're valuable as a sort of insurance policy, because here we are relying on the honeybee, but this honeybee does have a lot of health issues. So I think it would behoove us to have to maintain this insurance policy. So this is just a little plug, a little break in a way from the main story to remind you about this native bee diversity. And if you haven't already come up to take a look, there's some nice specimen display cases here that the Beatty Biodiversity Museum put together, and one other little case that Karen and I just put together. But there's some really nice cases up here that will show you some of these things. But I want to show you like a few things about bees that are really cool. First of all, the size range. I mean, this is amazing. Look at this tiny bee on the head capsule of a big carpenter bee, Xylocopa. So that's what pretty much expresses the size range of bees. Then their nesting habits. They do a lot of different things with nesting. As I mentioned, a lot of them are ground nesting, and you can see here this would be a small bee aggregation. Each of these holes would be a different female setting up her nest, and these are the tumuli around it. Here's a bee emerging from the nest. You can see her head capsule. Then there are those that nest in pre-existing cavities. We can put out wood with drilled holes in them to encourage their nesting. Some of them nest in reeds, and again, we can put out a bundle of reeds, and they'll often, the mason bees will add mud to the top of those to seal them off. Then we have our bumblebees. They tend to nest in pre-existing, in abandoned rodent nests underground, or sometimes in hollow trees. So lots of different nesting strategies. And then I wanted to tell you about bee watching. Well, it's probably a little bit too cold right now, and I don't know if there are many flowers out. So you might have to wait till spring. But next spring, when you do have some flowers, it's really fun to look at flowers and look at where did they carry their pollen, and that will help you figure out what kind of bee you're looking at. So our bumblebees and our honeybee, which is down here, they have these little baskets on their back legs, on the top part of their back leg, that they pack the pollen into, and they moisten it. So you'll see this lump of wet pollen. That's typical of those two groups. But then a lot of other bees have lots of long hairs on their back leg. It's called a scopa, and the pollen is dry, and you can see it. It's just kind of all over the place, just this big mass of pollen. And this one you can see there's pollen all over her body as well. Only the females collect pollen. The males, they're usually gadding about and sipping some nectar and talking up the ladies, like males tend to do. And then the females are out working and collecting the pollen, And then these are kind of my favorites. These are they're in the group the Megachilidae, and they collect pollen on their bellies, which is really neat. So they have these hairs going down their bellies, and you will see a characteristic behavior where they'll kind of kind of flap their belly against the flower, and they'll pick up the pollen that way. So those are just some neat things. So how can we bring back the native bees into our agricultural landscapes? Well, we need to re-diversify those landscapes. And here are some of the elements that we could have. First of all, we could have different crops. So we've got here orchards and different kinds of crops. We could have different non-crop vegetation, like maybe a hedgerow here, some riparian areas, marshy areas. And then in the landscape surrounding, we can have, again, different types of land uses. So we could have a pasture here, maybe a different type of crop over here, more hedgerows, and then some natural habitat patches. And all of these things working together provide really a nice habitat for these bees, both on the farm and off the farm. So here's the sort of array of things that I just mentioned, the different crops. We can plant some flowers right in the fields, flowering strips. Have different crops growing across the landscape, these hedgerows, riparian areas, and natural habitat patches. And they kind of array up from plot scale to the field scale to the landscape scale. And all these things collectively help to support the pollinators and thus the pollination. But farmers, pollination is just one of the many things that they care about and that they're managing. They're also managing nutrients, water, soils, pest control. Those are things they have to worry about. So one of the really interesting things that I realized by studying bees is that these elements of diversification in the farm field and environment have positive effects on a lot of these properties as well, not just on pollination. So we take a look at the whole thing, and these techniques collectively, what we call a diversified farming system, can have positive effects and promote sustainability of all of these things that the farmer has to manage. And they can do it in a way that reduces reliance on agrochemicals. It might not get rid of them altogether, but it can reduce the need for pesticides. And this has been shown in many places around the world. So then we have fewer environmental problems, we have fewer health problems for farm workers and for ourselves in terms of ingesting pesticides. So the diversified farming system, I spoke to a group of California growers, and one of them afterwards said that he liked this farm. This is the farm where we'd all like to live, he said. It's also the farm where the bees like to live. And I think it's the farms that we should be having in our landscapes. If people want to live in these kind of farms, and we want, and we can do better. They just need to be productive, and I personally believe they can be. And on farms like this is where the native pollinators alone can provide sufficient pollination services for crops. I'm just going to show that we have a lot of data to support this with various papers. And so I think that this diversified farming system is kind of a good concept, a winning concept for a healthy food system. It can, what we find by learning from the bees, what the bees need is actually something that could be pretty good for a lot of other components in the farm system, could lead us to a more sustainable system and a more healthy food production system for ourselves. So I just want to, this is my last slide, I just want to say that I really appreciate places like the Biodiversity Museum, because you can't do this kind of research without museum collections. And so we collect a lot of specimens. This is this tower of specimens, that's all one species. And museums usually actually don't really like that so much. But we need places to store our specimens. We need taxonomy. We need systematics to identify. We're still in the stage with bees where each bee just basically needs to be looked at by an expert. We can't just zap them with our Star Trek monitor and get the identification out yet. And I put this one here because they're so beautiful, and getting people to actually understand biodiversity is And the beauty of biodiversity is something that we need to do, and that museums, I know the Beatty Museum really is doing this. This is a really important function in order to promote biodiversity conservation. And then, of course, there's all the research that goes on at these museums behind the scenes. So I just want to put a plug in for that, and to thank all of you thank the Beatty Biodiversity Museum and Research Center for hosting me, and to all of you for coming to hear the talk. Many collaborators, students, field assistants, taxonomists, and landowners that I haven't specifically recognized, but obviously a lot of people have been involved in the work I've shared with you, as well as a lot of funding agencies. So thank you very much, and I'd love to take your questions and see you down here with the bees later.